The crisp morning air at Teterboro Airport carried the scent of jet fuel and ambition. Marcus Wellington adjusted the worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, the fabric of his maintenance coveralls rough against skin accustomed to Italian silk. At 42, he had built Wellington Aviation from a single charter plane into a fleet of 30 aircraft, but today he walked the tarmac as just another worker, invisible, unremarkable, black. His Gulfstream G650 gleamed under the hangar lights, its pristine white fuselage bearing the elegant WA logo he'd designed himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he needed a disguise to truly see his own company. 3 months of troubling reports about employee treatment had brought him here, clipboard in hand, steel-toed boots clicking against polished floors. The aircraft's cabin door stood ajar. Marcus climbed the stairs, his heart rate quickening with each step. Inside, the familiar luxury surrounded him: cream leather seats, mahogany trim, the soft hum of climate control. But something was wrong. A sound, barely audible, drifted from the galley. Sobbing, Marcus moved forward, his footsteps muffled by plush carpeting. In the narrow galley, a young woman sat hunched on a jump seat, her blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. Her shoulders shook with each silent cry, her flight attendant uniform wrinkled and stained with tears. "Miss, are you okay?" She looked up, blue eyes wide with terror. The transformation was instant, grief replaced by pure fear as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the galley wall. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't have any money on me." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here, in his own aircraft, wearing his company's uniform, this woman saw only what centuries of conditioning had taught her to see: a black man as a threat. Not an employee, not a human being offering help. Predator. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said softly, raising his hands. "I work here. Maintenance." But Sarah's eyes remained fixed on his dark skin, her breathing shallow and rapid. In that moment, Marcus understood with crushing clarity that all his wealth, all his success, all his power meant nothing when stripped of its external markers. The mask of his disguise had revealed a truth more painful than any boardroom betrayal. Even in the empire he had built, he was still just another black man to be feared. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken histories and inherited prejudices, as the morning sun cast long shadows through the aircraft windows. The fear in Sarah's eyes slowly gave way to embarrassment as Marcus remained motionless, his hands still raised in peaceful surrender. She wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers, mascara streaking black trails down her pale skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the aircraft's ventilation system. I don't know what I thought." Marcus lowered his hands carefully, each movement deliberate and non-threatening. 20 years of navigating white spaces had taught him this choreography of making others comfortable with his presence. Even in his own company, the dance continued. "You were crying," he said gently. "Something's wrong." Sarah's composure cracked again, fresh tears spilling over. The galley felt smaller now, intimate in its confinement, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across her anguished features. "It's Captain Reynolds," she began, then stopped, glancing toward the cockpit as if the man might materialize. "Yesterday God, I should have said something." The name hit Marcus like ice water. Reynolds, his most senior pilot, 15 years with the company, impeccable safety record. The man he'd personally recruited from Delta. What happened? Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, wedding ring catching the light. "There's this co-pilot, Amara. She's brilliant, really brilliant. Harvard-educated, flew for the Air Force. But Captain Reynolds, Her voice broke. "He treats her like she doesn't belong here." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression neutral. In the corporate world, he'd learned to mask his reactions, to let others reveal themselves fully before showing his hand. "Yesterday was the worst," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out like a confession. "We were doing pre-flight checks, and Amara questioned a fuel calculation. She was right, I could see it in the numbers. But Reynolds exploded. The galley walls seemed to close in as Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "This is what happens when we lower our standards for diversity hires. Some people just aren't cut out for this level of responsibility." The words hung in the recycled air like poison. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily, nails digging into his palms. This was his company, his aircraft, his responsibility. Amara just stood there, Sarah whispered. Professional, dignified, but I saw her hands shaking, and I said nothing. I just stood there like a coward. Why didn't you report it? Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. Report it to who? Reynolds has been here forever. He's untouchable. And I'm just a flight attendant who needs this job. Marcus studied her face. The guilt etched in every line. The fear that kept her complicit in a system she clearly despised. How many others in his company felt trapped in this same silence? Where's Amara now? Grounded pending a performance review, Sarah said, air quotes bitter with sarcasm. Reynolds filed a report questioning her judgment. The injustice of it burned in Marcus's chest, but he forced his voice to remain steady. And you believe she was right about the fuel? I know she was right. Sarah met his eyes for the first time. But who's going to believe the black co-pilot over Captain Reynolds? Sarah's eyes grew distant, lost in memories that clearly haunted her. The galley's cramped space felt heavy with unspoken truths as she began to unravel the systematic destruction of a career. It started small, she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had replayed these moments countless times. Little things that seemed almost professional. Marcus leaned against the galley counter, his maintenance coveralls a stark reminder of how easily identity could be masked or revealed. In boardrooms, he commanded respect with a single glance. Here, he was just another pair of ears for Sarah's confession. The aircraft's interior lights dimmed slightly as clouds passed over the hangar, casting shifting shadows across Sarah's face. She stared at her hands, wedding ring spinning nervously around her finger. Amara joined us 8 months ago. MIT Aeronautical Engineering, Air Force Academy, combat missions in Afghanistan. Her resume was flawless. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of admiration and frustration. But from day one, Reynolds treated her like she was on probation. The memories seemed to play out before Sarah's eyes like a film reel of accumulated injustices. Marcus could see the weight of each incident etched in the lines around her eyes. He'd make her repeat safety checks that other co-pilots did once. Just want to be thorough, he'd say, but only with her. During briefings, he'd question every decision she made, even when she was following standard protocol. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a deliberate campaign designed to undermine confidence and competence. Last month, during a flight to Chicago, Amara suggested an altitude adjustment for better fuel efficiency. She was right. I checked the weather reports later, but Reynolds shot her down in front of the passengers. What did he say? Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Some people think book learning makes them pilots. Real aviation comes from experience, not affirmative action. The words hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Marcus had heard variations of this poison his entire career, the suggestion that his achievements were gifts rather than earned victories, that his presence diminished rather than enhanced. The performance reviews started after that, Sarah continued. Suddenly, Amara's communication skills needed improvement. Her decision-making under pressure was questioned. All subjective measures that couldn't be disputed with facts. Through the aircraft windows, Marcus could see ground crew moving with purpose across the tarmac, unaware of the reckoning taking place inside his plane. Each of Sarah's words was another nail in Reynolds' professional coffin, but also another reminder of how insidious racism could be when wrapped in corporate language. She never complained, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Not once. She just worked harder, stayed later, studied more. Like she thought she could prove them wrong through sheer excellence. But excellence wasn't enough. It never is it? Sarah looked up at him, and for a moment, Marcus saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Not of his identity, but of their shared understanding of how the system worked. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of Amara's crushed dreams and Sarah's complicit guilt. The weight of Sarah's confession settled between them like a physical presence. Marcus studied her face. The genuine anguish, the self-recrimination, the helplessness of someone who had witnessed injustice and chosen silence over risk. He had reached a crossroads where his disguise had served its purpose, revealing truths that boardroom meetings and corporate reports could never uncover. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that made her look up, "I need to tell you something." He reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a business card with deliberate slowness. The morning light streaming through the aircraft windows caught the embossed lettering as he handed it to her. Sarah's eyes widened as she read the card, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, shock. The color drained from her cheeks as the reality hit her. You're Marcus Wellington. You own this company." "I am." Marcus watched her process this revelation, seeing the mortification bloom across her features. "And everything you just told me about Captain Reynolds and Amara, it's happening in my company, under my watch." Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the card. "Oh God, I thought you were. I assumed." Her voice trailed off, the weight of her initial reaction crashing down on her. "You assumed I was a threat because I'm black," Marcus said, not unkindly but with unflinching honesty. "Just like Reynolds assumes Amara doesn't belong because she's black." The parallel hung in the air between them, undeniable and damning. Sarah's face crumpled with shame, but Marcus continued, his voice steady and measured. "3 weeks ago, I walked into the Four Seasons for a business dinner. I was wearing a $3,000 suit, but the maitre d' asked if I was there for a delivery." Marcus's tone remained conversational, but Sarah could hear the accumulated pain beneath. "Last month, at a charity gala I sponsored, security followed me to the bathroom. They thought I was crashing the event." Sarah listened in stunned silence as Marcus painted a picture of wealth that couldn't wash away the stain of prejudice. The aircraft's climate control hummed softly, the only sound in the heavy quiet. "I've built a billion-dollar company, but I still get pulled over for driving suspiciously in my own neighborhood. I still have white colleagues surprised when I speak articulately in meetings. I still have people assume I'm the help when I'm actually the boss." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here, in his own aircraft, wearing coveralls instead of Armani, Marcus had experienced the same assumptions that plagued every black person regardless of their station. "Money doesn't change the color of my skin, Sarah. Success doesn't erase centuries of conditioning. And apparently, owning this airline doesn't protect my employees from the same prejudice I face every day." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For how I reacted. For staying silent about Reynolds. For—" "Don't apologize to me," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "Apologize to Amara. She's the one whose career is being destroyed while we all stand by and watch." The challenge in his words was clear. Sarah sat in the galley of an aircraft owned by a black billionaire, confronted with the reality that her silence had enabled the very system that had just humiliated them both. The question now was what she would do with this knowledge. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the hangar floor, as if the very light was demanding that hidden truths finally be exposed. The call had been simple enough. Marcus, using his executive assistant's voice and authority, had summoned Captain Reynolds to the aircraft for an urgent meeting with senior management regarding Amara's performance review. What Reynolds didn't know was that he was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap, one that would expose the rot festering within Wellington Aviation's ranks. Marcus remained in his maintenance coveralls, clipboard in hand, as footsteps echoed up the aircraft stairs. Sarah had positioned herself in the main cabin, her face a mask of professional composure despite the storm brewing beneath. The morning light streaming through the windows cast everything in sharp relief, as if the universe itself demanded clarity. Captain Reynolds entered with the swagger of a man accustomed to command. 53 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of being the unquestioned authority in any room. His pilot's uniform was immaculate, for gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders like badges of untouchable privilege. His eyes swept the cabin dismissively until they landed on Marcus, still bent over his clipboard near the galley. The transformation in Reynolds' expression was immediate, annoyance mixed with casual disdain. "Hey you!" Reynolds barked, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone used to being ignored. "Maintenance crew shouldn't be here during executive meetings. Clear out." Marcus looked up slowly, meeting Reynolds' eyes with deliberate calm. "Just finishing up some safety checks, Captain. Won't be long." "I don't care what you're doing. I said get out." Reynolds' tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his right to dismiss those he deemed beneath him. "And next time, use the service entrance. This is a business aircraft, not a garage." The words hung in the recycled air like poison gas. Sarah's intake of breath was audible, but Reynolds didn't notice. His attention was already shifting away from the black man he'd just relegated to invisibility. Marcus straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. 20 years of building his empire had taught him the power of patience, of letting others reveal themselves completely before striking. "Of course, Captain. Wouldn't want to interfere with important business." "Damn right," Reynolds muttered, settling into one of the leather seats with proprietary ease. "Where are these executives anyway? I don't have all day to discuss why we need to cut our losses with that co-pilot." The casual dismissal of Amara's career sent ice through Marcus's veins, but he maintained his facade. "They should be here soon, along with the co-pilot in question." "Good. The sooner we resolve this diversity experiment, the better." Reynolds loosened his tie, clearly comfortable in what he believed was friendly company. "Between you and me, some people just aren't cut out for this level of responsibility. All the affirmative action in the world can't change basic competence." Sarah's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. She was watching a man destroy himself with his own words, unaware that every syllable was being absorbed by the very person who could end his career with a single phone call. The sound of footsteps on the aircraft stairs interrupted Reynolds' casual bigotry. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as a familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway. Amara Johnson, 34 years old, her pilot's uniform pressed to perfection despite the weight of uncertainty she carried. Her dark skin seemed to glow against the white of her shirt, her natural hair pulled back in a professional bun that couldn't hide the intelligence burning in her eyes. She paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. Reynolds lounging comfortably, Sarah rigid with tension, and Marcus still holding his clipboard like a shield. The air in the cabin suddenly felt electric, charged with the potential for either justice or devastation. "Captain Reynolds," Amara said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I was told there would be executives here to discuss my performance review." Reynolds' smile was predatory, satisfied. "Oh, there will be. And after today, I think we'll all agree that some standards simply can't be compromised." The trap was set. All the players were in position, and Marcus Wellington, still invisible in his maintenance disguise, prepared to reveal just how catastrophically wrong Captain Reynolds had been about everything. The moment stretched taut as a wire, all three people suspended in the artificial calm before the storm. Amara stood in the doorway, her posture military straight despite the uncertainty clouding her eyes. Reynolds lounged in his seat like a king holding court, oblivious to the fact that his kingdom was about to crumble. Sarah gripped her armrests, knuckles white with the tension of secrets about to explode. Marcus set down his clipboard with deliberate precision, the small sound echoing in the cabin like a gavel. The morning sun had shifted, casting harsh shadows through the windows that seemed to divide the aircraft into territories of light and darkness. "Captain Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone freeze. "Before we begin this performance review, I think introductions are in order." He reached into his coverall pocket and withdrew his wallet, extracting the same business card he'd shown Sarah hours earlier. The leather of the aircraft seats seemed to hold its breath as he extended it toward Reynolds. "Marcus Wellington, owner and CEO of Wellington Aviation." The transformation in Reynolds' face was cinematic in its completeness. Confusion melting into recognition, recognition crystallizing into horror. The business card trembled in his suddenly unsteady hands as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "Mr. Wellington, I didn't realize." Reynolds' voice cracked like ice under pressure. "If I had known you were—" "What? Black?" Marcus's tone was conversational, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "Would that have changed how you spoke to me? How you dismissed me? How you assumed I didn't belong in my own aircraft?" Amara's sharp intake of breath was audible. Her eyes moved between Marcus and Reynolds, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. The man she'd been told to fear in this performance review was actually the owner of the company, and he'd witnessed everything. "Sir, please let me explain," Reynolds started, but Marcus raised a hand. "Oh, please do explain. Explain how you've systematically undermined one of the most qualified pilots in my fleet. Explain your comments about diversity experiments and affirmative action. Explain how you've created a hostile work environment that violates every principle this company was built on." The cabin felt smaller now, the luxury appointments seeming to close in around Reynolds as his carefully constructed world collapsed. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the perfect climate control. "Amara," Marcus continued, turning to face her directly, "Captain Reynolds here was just telling me how some people aren't cut out for this level of responsibility. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that assessment." Amara's voice, when it came, was steady as steel. "With respect, sir, my flight record speaks for itself. 0 incidents, commendations for fuel efficiency, and passenger satisfaction scores in the top 5% of the fleet. And yet you're here for a performance review." "Yes, sir. Based on Captain Reynolds' reports questioning my judgment and communication skills." Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's not what happened." All eyes turned to her as she stood, her legs shaky but her voice growing stronger with each word. The flight attendant who had cowered in fear hours earlier was finding her courage in the crucible of truth. "I was there for every incident Captain Reynolds reported. Amara was right about the fuel calculations. She was right about the altitude adjustments. She was professional even when he—" Sarah's voice caught, but she pushed forward. "Even when he made those comments about diversity hires and lowered standards." Reynolds' face had gone ashen, his silver hair seeming to age him decades in moments. "Sarah, you're misunderstanding the context." "Am I?" Her voice was sharp now, cutting. "Was I misunderstanding when you said, real aviation comes from experience, not affirmative action? Was I misunderstanding when you made her repeat safety checks that you never required from white co-pilots?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the sounds of the airport continued. Engines warming up, ground crews working, the business of aviation proceeding normally while inside this aircraft. A reckoning 20 years in the making was finally taking place. Marcus looked at each person in turn. Reynolds, sweating and desperate. Amara, standing tall despite the injustices she'd endured. Sarah, finally finding her voice after months of complicit silence. The decision he made in the next few moments would ripple through his company and beyond. "Captain Reynolds," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you're terminated. Effective immediately." But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus knew that firing one man wouldn't solve the deeper problem. The question now was whether this moment of truth would become a catalyst for real change, or just another corporate scandal quietly swept away. The aircraft cabin held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The termination of Captain Reynolds sent shockwaves through Wellington aviation that reverberated far beyond the confines of the aircraft cabin. Within hours, the news had spread through the company's network like wildfire. Whispered conversations in break rooms, hurried phone calls between crew members, and a palpable shift in the atmosphere that everyone could feel but few could articulate. Marcus stood in his corner office 3 days later, watching aircraft taxi across the tarmac below. The view from the 42nd floor had always given him perspective, but now it carried the weight of responsibility in ways he'd never fully grasped. His empire, built on precision and excellence, had harbored the very prejudices he'd spent his life fighting against. The legal department had been swift and thorough. Reynolds' termination was airtight, documented discrimination, hostile work environment, violation of company policies. But Marcus knew that removing one man wouldn't excise the cancer that had been growing in his organization's culture. "The diversity audit results are in," his assistant announced, placing a thick folder on his mahogany desk. The numbers told a story he'd been blind to: promotion rates, complaint patterns, retention statistics that painted a picture of systemic bias hiding behind corporate politeness. Amara's promotion to captain had been announced that morning, but Marcus understood that her elevation was just the beginning, not the end. Real change required more than symbolic gestures. It demanded a fundamental restructuring of how his company operated at every level. How do you rebuild trust that was never fully there to begin with? He asked himself, staring at the folder's contents. The mandatory diversity training sessions had begun company-wide, but Marcus insisted they go beyond typical corporate workshops. These were uncomfortable conversations about unconscious bias, privilege, and the subtle ways discrimination manifested in daily interactions. Some employees embraced the initiative. Others resisted with the passive aggression of those forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah had become an unexpected ally in this transformation. Her guilt over her previous silence had crystallized into fierce advocacy. She'd volunteered to lead the Flight Attendant Diversity Committee, using her position to amplify voices that had been marginalized for too long. "Change is messy," she'd told Marcus during one of their weekly check-ins. "But silence is messier." The new reporting system allowed anonymous complaints, and the responses had been overwhelming. Stories of microaggressions, passed-over promotions, and casual racism that had festered in the shadows. Each report was a reminder that Reynolds hadn't been an isolated case, but rather a symptom of deeper institutional problems. Marcus implemented zero-tolerance policies with teeth, not just termination threats, but mandatory bias training for managers, diverse hiring panels, and regular climate surveys. The measures were comprehensive, but he knew that policies on paper meant nothing without cultural transformation. Real change takes generations, he reflected, watching a plane piloted by a Mara taxi toward the runway. But it starts with individual moments of courage. The work was far from over. In fact, Marcus realized it was just beginning. The question now wasn't whether his company could change, but whether it could sustain that change when the spotlight moved elsewhere and the hard work of daily transformation continued in the shadows. The pre-dawn sky over Teterboro stretched like brushed steel, stars fading into the promise of another day. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything, and the same Gulfstream G650 that had witnessed Captain Reynolds' downfall now prepared for its most symbolic flight yet. Captain Amara Johnson stood at the aircraft's entrance, her 4 gold stripes catching the hangar lights. The weight of command sat naturally on her shoulders, not the burden of proving herself worthy, but the confidence of someone whose worth had finally been recognized. Her pre-flight inspection was thorough but unhurried, each check performed with the precision that had always defined her work. "Good morning, Captain," Sarah said, approaching with the passenger manifest. The dynamic between them had evolved from witness and victim to colleagues united by shared purpose. Sarah's role as lead flight attendant on this London route represented more than professional advancement. It was a partnership forged in the crucible of truth. "Morning, Sarah. Ready for our first transatlantic together?" "More than ready." Sarah's smile carried the weight of their journey. "It feels right, doesn't it? Like we're finally where we're supposed to be." The passenger cabin gleamed with familiar luxury, but the atmosphere felt different now. Lighter somehow, as if the aircraft itself had been cleansed of the toxicity that once poisoned its air. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed brighter, more hopeful. Marcus Wellington watched from the terminal, no longer in disguise but observing with the same careful attention that had revealed the truth months earlier. His undercover inspections had become routine, not because he distrusted his employees, but because he understood that vigilance against discrimination required constant commitment. Progress wasn't a destination but a journey that demanded daily renewal. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and Marcus felt a familiar mixture of pride and responsibility. His company had changed, but the work was far from over. Each flight, each interaction, each hiring decision was an opportunity to either reinforce progress or allow old patterns to resurface. Tower, Wellington 77 requesting clearance for departure. Amara's voice crackled over the radio, professional and confident. As the aircraft lifted into the dawn sky, Marcus reflected on the lessons learned. Wealth and power meant nothing if they weren't used to lift others up. Silence in the face of injustice was complicity, regardless of good intentions. And real change required not just moments of courage, but sustained commitment to doing better every single day. The Gulf Stream disappeared into the morning clouds, carrying with it the promise that progress, however imperfect, was possible when people chose to act rather than simply observe. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, full of challenges yet to be faced and victories yet to be won. But for now, in this moment, justice had wings.